Sup internet, Raggedy Adams here. One of the things you've probably noticed about me is that I'm quite a big comic book fan. I mean, the Watchman canvas, the Transmetropolitan acoustic guitar, and the Sandman bass case probably give that away a little bit. It's usually pretty straightforward how individual comic book characters work, because they usually do exactly what they say on the tin. Batman has bats, Aquaman lives in the sea, Wonder Woman is a wonder. But when it comes to comic book companies and explaining how they work and how they interact with each other, it's a little more hard to explain to someone who doesn't know how that stuff all works. And how and why the different rivalries between them came about is kind of a little awkward. I tried to think of the closest way I could describe it in a way that was like comic books but different and distinct from them. So, for the benefit of everyone, here is If Comic Books Were Like Film Studios. I should probably explain that this is entirely fictional and hypothetical and off the top of my own head, and there are probably very little actual real-world similarities between films and comic books, but for the sake of the argument, it gets the point across. Number 1. The Big Two. So like any kind of industry where you have lots of different choices, there's usually like the two big ones. Your Cokes and your Pepsis, your Microsofts and your Apples, your Conservatives and your Liberals. Because everybody's different and likes different things, but everybody's sort of similar. Not so similar that everyone likes the same thing, but just similar enough for people to notice it. The example of that in comic books is always going to be, without exception, Marvel and DC. Simple as that. For two important reasons. One, they have all the toys. Literally, they have all the characters that are well known, and they're not letting them go anytime soon. Second, and this is where the synchronicity comes in, they own both the means of development and production. Marvel employs people to come up with comic books, which they then package and sell. Marvel owns those characters, and they can therefore sell the rights to make toys and t-shirts and lunchboxes and cartoons and films and stuff based on that idea. Same with DC. The difference being, Warner Brothers have owned DC Comics for a long time, since at least the early 80s, and they own all the rights to everything that DC does. They own Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, the Justice League. All that entire shared universe is owned by DC and by extension Warner Brothers. So you think that would make it easy for them to negotiate film deals and things like that. Well, that's where reality kind of comes into it, but that's another story for another time. Marvel, on the other hand, until very recently, has always been a sort of a free agent. And because for a long time they weren't owned by a single media conglomerate, like DC are owned by Warner Brothers, they were able to shop their ideas around to lots of different people. And recently they were bought by the Walt Disney Company, who now basically own the entirety of Marvel. Well, I say that, they don't really own all of Marvel, but again, that's another story and an unpleasant one too. But let's move on. So the easiest way of describing comic books in terms of film companies actually turns out to be these two examples, because they are owned by two of the largest media conglomerates in the entirety of Hollywood. And just like the way that both Disney and Warner Brothers have their own little satellite companies like Miramax and Touchstone for Disney and New Line and HBO for Warner Brothers, Marvel and DC have satellite companies of their own. DC has Vertigo and Wildstorm. Marvel has Marvel Knights and Icon. And just like Marvel and DC's rivalry hasn't gotten in the way of them working together on collaborations over the years, so too have Warner Brothers and Disney worked together in the past. Anyone remember Roger Rabbit? Well, aside from the fact that he's not an original Disney character anyway, in the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a co-production between Steven Spielberg's old company Amblin and Touchstone Pictures, Spielberg was able to convince several companies, including Warner Brothers, to lend several cartoon characters to use in the film. You may well remember the scene where Eddie Valiant is falling through the sky and he's intercepted in the middle of the air by Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny. Now you may notice, if you go back and rewatch that scene, that Mickey and Bugs both have the same amount of dialogue. That was not coincidental. That was the result of a lot of bargaining between Disney and Warner Brothers. That both of their mascots would be on screen at the same time and would be given the exact same amount of screen time and dialogue together. So that's the big two. Let's have a look at some of the other players in the industry. Number 2, Dark Horse Comics. So in an industry where you basically have like the two big behemoths fighting over first place, Dark Horse is kind of the one that comes just in afterwards. They're not looking for first place, but they're trying to keep up. Some of the Dark Horse concepts that have been turned into films that you may recognise are things like The Mask with Jim Carrey, or Sin City, or Hellboy. So it's pretty clear the kind of stuff they focus on is usually stuff like horror, science fiction, the kind of stuff that you can't really get from like the big two. And I think I'm pretty on the money here when I say the closest to them in terms of a film company that actually exists would probably be something like Universal. Going all the way back to the 30s and 40s, Universal had this reputation for being very much interested in creating films about creatures and monsters and horror, in much the same way as Disney has kind of reappropriated fairy tales. Universal have done the same with a lot of horror characters, like Dracula and Frankenstein and the Mummy. Even in contemporary times, with films like Jaws and Jurassic Park, they deal with the sort of the supernatural and the bizarre, and that's where their strength sort of lies. Number 3, Image Comics. Okay, so I know you didn't come here for like a history lesson or whatever, but this is the one that's going to require the most context, so try to be patient with me, and I will try and break it down as straightforward as I can. Image Comics is most like United Artists and DreamWorks. Okay, so at the end of the 80s, Todd McFarlane, Chris Claremont, Rob Liefeld, and Mark Silvestri broke away from Marvel Comics to form their own company. Mostly because they were frustrated with the work-for-hire situation in comics at the time and the way that royalties were distributed to artists, which is, again, a whole other story, but it kind of links in with the other stuff, so bear with me here. Whilst United Artists was formed by W.D. Griffith, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks in 1919. Similarly, DreamWorks was founded by Steven Spielberg, former Disney chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg, and music mogul David Geffen. So basically the idea when all three of these companies formed was that they were going to be like the supergroup. They were going to be like Cream or Led Zeppelin or any sort of like cool band that is just like formed from like the remnants of several other smaller but equally cool bands. And the whole idea basically was that they wanted to be their own bosses and to create things without studios bossing them around or having to answer to people. Now, I don't want to make any hard and fast assumptions here. You may be a massive comic book fan, you might be a massive film fan. But chances are, if you've not heard of United Artists, it will be for the same reason that you've only heard of one image character. The people who founded United Artists were the original Hollywood superstars. W.D. Griffith was arguably one of the first American filmmakers to understand cinematic language, and he created the film Birth of a Nation. Basically, every time you hear Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyrie in a film, W.D. Griffith was the one who did it first. Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were like the original celebrity super couple. They were like the Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, or the Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor of the silent era. And Charlie Chaplin was, well, Charlie Chaplin, but you know. Likewise, at the end of the 80s and the start of the 90s, when they founded the company, the founders of Image were arguably the most popular and famous artists in comic books at the time. Mostly because a lot of them were associated with the explosion of X-Men titles in the 80s. But the sad truth is that one thing they all had in common was they were not good business people. In the same way, United Artists didn't anticipate the rise of big-budget filmmaking, or the introduction of sound to films, which killed a lot of people's careers. The founders of Image didn't really account for the fact that a lot of them weren't very good writers, some weren't even particularly good artists, and none of them knew how to run a comic book company on their own. And whilst Image still struggles on, United Artists is essentially dead in the water.